pushing for increase in value-added tax, but seeking for a reduction in companies' income tax for small businesses to improve compliance. Fowler was speaking on the sidelines of the presentation of the Nigerian Tax Outlook in Lagos. Well, I have with me in the studio tax partner with PricewaterhouseCoopers, Isiri Agbeyi, that's Tax and Regulatory Services, PricewaterhouseCoopers. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
What did you hear when you heard about the, well, he said it was misquoted, actually, talking about an increase in VAT, value-added tax. How did you take it?
So I don't think that news came out right. It wasn't positively received, mostly because I think we were thinking more about how that would impact the economy. And it came also at a time when the minimum wage was just recently approved. So what we understood at the time was that this was supposed to fund the minimum wage. So whether that is right, I think needs to be taken from a very holistic view to look at the impact on the economy, but more importantly, the impact on the people who we say we've increased minimum wages for.
For a country that's trying to shore up revenue, like Nigeria, we know what we are facing. Non-oil has been the focus. What do you expect? How do we get these funds?
So yeah, typically what you want is to generate tax revenues, and we all know the story about Nigeria's tax revenues being ridiculously low relative to other countries. And what you would find in other countries is that VAT tends to be a good source of such tax revenues for many reasons. It's an indirect tax, it's easier to administer and collect. It also has positive impact in terms of the larger economic growth, mostly because it doesn't increase your cost of capital if it's run properly as a true VAT system. But what we have in Nigeria is one that is really flawed. So we don't really have what we'll call a VAT. It's more a sales tax. So that at the end of the day, if we continue to increase those rates, we don't enjoy the benefits like we'd see in other jurisdictions.
I spoke to Fowler, yeah, just like you said, other jurisdictions. He cited Ghana, cited the UK, South Africa, saying that they're paying more than what we pay at the moment. So what's the difference?
Yeah, that's a good question. The difference is, one, on the surface, the tax rates or VAT rates in those countries are way higher than Nigeria. That's a fact. So if you look at Ghana, for instance, it might be as high as 17.5%, in South Africa 15%, and Nigeria is just 5%. But the difference is in the detail, and it's in the detail in that act. So for instance, with our VAT system, there's a lot of restrictions on how much you can recover in terms of VAT you suffer on purchases. And the way a VAT system should work is that it should flow through and only end directly on the consumer, so that when a manufacturer makes a sale and has to charge VAT, any VAT that he suffered on purchases necessary to deliver that product, he should be able to recover it. So it just flows in, goes out to the final consumer who bears the burden. But what we have in Nigeria is a very restrictive system where you cannot recover VAT on everything that you've purchased. So if you imported equipment, you paid VAT at the port, you can't recover that VAT against the VAT you will charge on the final product. You have to capitalize that cost and depreciate over time. So what that means is we then have irrecoverable layers of VAT in any manufacturing system, and it's even worse off with service companies, because if you're a service company, you can't even recover any VAT at all because you don't have any tangible product that you're charging the VAT on. So what it means is that a lot of companies in our private sector have a huge overload of irrecoverable VAT. If we decided to measure the true impact of the VAT cost that we incur as consumers, it's way higher than that 5%. We would be looking at the range of 20% or even more. And I think that's something that needs to be critically looked at. So what we would recommend, or I would recommend, is a major overhaul of the VAT Act. You need to operate a proper VAT system before you then start campaigning around increasing the rates, because right now we don't have a true VAT system. So if we compare ourselves to Ghana, South Africa, it's a very unbalanced comparison. Two, we need to also start to ask questions around how do we tax basic items or necessities. In other jurisdictions, one of the reasons I mentioned VAT being a good opportunity to raise tax revenues is because it doesn't have the attribute of increasing the cost of capital like income taxes have. VAT doesn't have that, so it's perfect. But the downside with it is it doesn't respect the income of individual earnings. So there's the tendency that you can get to a stage where there's inequality because we're charged VAT on the same item. You go to a shop, I buy biscuits, you buy biscuits. Whether you are rich, whether you are poor, it doesn't matter, you're going to pay the same VAT. So what do people do or what do countries do to negate that impact? It's by introducing a system called zero rating or exemption of basic items that the common man would use. By the time they exempt those, it sort of bridges that gap. There is an exemption all right in our Act, but what has happened is that there is no clear definition as to what those basic items are. So there's always confusion. Sometimes with the tax authorities, you hear things like, oh, pure water is exempt from VAT. Well, bottled water is not exempt because it's a luxury item. You know, so that's a huge divergence from what we see in perfect VAT systems. Another thing is, as well, is the administration of the VAT Act. It is so expensive for us in Nigeria administering VAT. Why? We don't have a threshold for who we charge VAT on. Your regular malam on the road who is selling small items would be required to register for VAT because of the way we have defined taxpayers in our VAT Act. So the cost of administering VAT is way more expensive than the revenues that we even collect. And so what we advance for is that there should be a threshold introduced in that VAT Act so that you're actually focusing on the right categories. And if an item is exempt or zero rated, you don't necessarily have to register for VAT to collect the revenues.
Siri Agbi, I know you can go on. The passion is there. Partner, tax, regulatory, PricewaterhouseCoopers. That's what that's what we can take for now. Thank you so much for spending your
Thank you very much for having me.